Good morning. First of all, I want to welcome you to this gathering today, and especially for braving the rainy day, the day before Thanksgiving. So I'm most grateful to you for actually coming to our briefing. I'm Venki Narayanamurthy. I took over the directorship of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School 3 years ago or thereabouts, when John Holden moved as director of OSTP, and along with me, and this project we're going to talk about was started by him in 2008 and really went into full gear with the 2009 till now period. My co-principal investigator in this project is Matt Bunn, who for a long period has been associate, including having served in OSTP, and is well known for his work, especially in nuclear policy. And then the actual project, the person who actually makes sure everything runs and actually provides a lot of input, is Dr. Laura Diaz-Anadon. She is also a lecturer at the Kennedy School right now and has vast experience in this space and started her career with John 4 or 5 years ago in this area. We also have with us, this work could not be done without a lot of research. And the research, in large measure, besides Laura, was also done by about half a dozen fellows, you will see, and 3 of them are here today sitting in the front row, and we will have them recognized. I also want to, at the very beginning, really thank the AAAS. I belong to the Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy of the AAAS, and we were having a meeting, and they went around the table. This is back in a few months ago, and I said we will be having an energy report. So Steve Nelson said, why don't you do it at the AAAS? And Bethany has been very, very helpful indeed, and she really deserves a round of thanks. So what I will do, we will have a relatively brief presentation, and then hopefully we can open up for discussion. And each one of us will take turns to talk about various pieces of the report. Outside, you will find the executive summary, which is really the executive summary of the report. The major report is at the printers, and we should be having copies of it in about next week or so, but it is as a PDF. You will be able to access it as of today at the Belfair Center website, and you can easily get the website. There's also an ETIP website. So the full report, which is quite a bit thicker than this, Laura and Matt broke their back just bringing the 100 copies of the executive summary. So there is a fair amount of work which some of these people sitting in the front row did, which actually provides some of the substance to what we'll be talking about. So I'd like to just say a couple of words here and then have Laura speak to you. I think to this audience, everybody should know that energy, whether you are an environmental person, whether you think of security, whether you think of economy, or you are a social person who wants to help the billions of poor people in the world, in all of those different areas, energy is going to be a defining thing for the 21st century. And the climate issue itself is large, the environmental impacts are large, and the economic impact is huge. The big demands which are happening, not just in India and China. I'm just returning from Africa. Africa will be the next one 10 years down the road, and we need to be sure that the poorest of the poor will have access to the energy. Finally, we all know there are huge security implications, especially oil has been in many of the unstable regions, and there are other issues of security connected with nuclear proliferation as you use nuclear energy, etc. So there are many of these different issues. The ERD3 project, ERD3 stands for Energy Research, Development, and Demonstration and Deployment. That's why there are 3 Ds. We divided the subject into 4 major parts. Part number 1, which Laura will be talking about very shortly, is the role of the federal government investments in RD&D. It's a vast space, and we used a large number of experts, 100 experts and experts elicitations, as well as 23 other expert reviewers, and used economic modeling using experts' cost and performance projections and uncertainty estimates to say where one should make the investments. Second, we worried a lot about U.S. energy innovation institutions. There have been a lot of changes in the landscape over the last few years, and I think this is still very much an ongoing study, but we did case studies of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Semiconductor Research Corporation. Even though Semiconductor Research Corporation is a different area, we thought there was enough comparisons with solar cells, etc., that it would be good to get some lessons learned from other areas of cooperative working with industry. And then, in general, we had some broad issues of the management of national laboratories, and we convened a very large workshop in December last year on the issue of the demonstration challenge, which is a very big challenge in getting the things to go. The other two areas we focused on was the private sector. The private sector obviously is going to be very important. None of this will happen. The government has a role, but ultimately it has to be in industry. Large-scale pilot survey was done. This is the first such survey, so it's actually all new data. Analysis of DOE private sector partnerships and modeling of carbon caps and other policies. And finally, we thought the international piece is going to be important. We all know, we talk about China and India and the BRICS countries, and there's a lot of new data on exactly how these countries are doing and what should happen also with international technology agreements, which will be increasingly part of the national scene. So Laura will talk about that first part. I will come back and say a few words on the management of innovation institutions, and then Matt will close with the private-public partnerships and the international agreements. Laura.
Thank you, Venki. I will now describe briefly how we came to our recommendations of how much the US government should invest in energy research, development, and demonstration. Our goal with this part of the project was to develop a methodology that allowed us to compare the benefits of investing different technologies in a consistent manner and also in a transparent manner, while accounting for uncertainty for the fact that we don't really know where technologies are going to be in the future, and also for the interactions of technologies in the marketplace, for the fact that some technologies are complements, some technologies are substitutes to some extent. Our hope was to provide a neutral recommendation that could help the budget allocation process. In the first phase of the work, as Venki mentioned, what we did was to conduct expert elicitations, which are formal surveys of about 100 experts from industry, from academia, and from the national labs. And we covered 7 technology areas in these surveys. We covered 4 supply-side technology areas: nuclear energy, fossil energy, bioenergy, and photovoltaic energy. 1 enabling technology area, utility-scale energy storage, and 2 demand-side technology areas. We covered different vehicle types and efficiency in buildings. In particular, we looked at commercial buildings. As you can see, in each of these areas, we also had more granular technology definitions. And what we did in these surveys was that we asked experts what they thought about the cost and performance of these technologies in 2030 under a business-as-usual scenario of R&D funding. We asked for their uncertainty around this cost and performance, and then we asked the experts to explain or to tell us what they recommend investing in these technologies, and then to tell us how the expectations about cost and performance would change based on their recommended levels of R&D investments in the different technology areas. What we can see in this graph is a summary of some of the answers we obtained from the experts. What we see to the left of the vertical line is decreases in the expected cost of the different technologies when compared to a business-as-usual funding scenario. So the more you are to the left, the more that R&D is going to do to decrease the expected cost of a technology. The horizontal lines show the range between the maximum and the minimum reduction expected by the experts, and the circle shows the median expectation from the experts. Now, this is just a way of showing in one graph a lot of the answers that we got from the experts, but what you can see from this graph is that the technologies where greater decreases in cost as a result of R&D investments from the government are in storage, in photovoltaics, and in fossil energy, and we can see smaller decreases in, for example, in vehicles as a result of government R&D. But this is just to give you a sense of the type of information we collected. So once we had this information, we introduced it in Marcal. It's a bottom-up energy economic model, and we worked with Brookhaven National Lab on this project. And we introduced these basically probability distribution functions of cost and performance in Marcal. And I'll show you some of the results of this modeling exercise, and then I'll go to the conclusions on this section on R&D investments. So here in this graph, what we have are trajectories of carbon dioxide emissions from the energy sector in the US between 2010 and 2050. What you see on the left-hand side is a result of modeling using what we call the middle experts. The middle experts are the experts that had projections that fell in the middle, more or less, of what different experts said. So some experts were more optimistic about cost in 2050 and 2030, and some experts were more pessimistic. So the middle experts represent the average expert in a sense. On the right-hand side, we have the modeling results using the projections from the optimistic experts. In blue, we have the uncertainty range on CO2 emissions under a business as usual R&D funding scenario. And for the 7 technology areas that we modeled, this business as usual scenario amounts to a total of about $2 billion. And in red, we can see the impact of increasing R&D funding for these 7 technology areas to between $50 and $80 billion. So a very significant increase in R&D funding. What you see here is that that even when we have the optimistic experts, and even when we are at the very bottom edge, so even if all of the optimistic experts are right, even if their best projections are right, or the most optimistic projections are right, and the federal government invests a lot, $80 billion in R&D in these 7 technology areas, the CO2 emissions in 2050 are very, very unlikely to be on par or in a range similar to that would be consistent with reducing greenhouse gas CO2 emissions by 83% when compared to 2005 levels by 2050. So what we are saying from this analysis, taking into account uncertainty and the interaction of technologies in the marketplace, is something that a lot of people had said before, which is that you absolutely need a demand-side policy, such a clean energy standard, a carbon tax, or a cap and trade to actually get the emissions reductions that we will need. So in addition to talking about what we need in addition to R&D to get us to CO2 emissions reductions, we also found that increases in R&D increase the benefits or from different policies. And I'll show you some of the results from that analysis. Here what we have is the consumer and producer surplus change of different R&D scenarios when compared to a business as usual R&D scenario. And this looks a little complicated, but basically what we have in groups are the no policy scenario, so assuming that policy stays as we have today. CO2 means a carbon cap, a strict carbon cap on CO2 emissions in the United States. The next one is having optimistic assumptions and a carbon cap, and the last 2 scenarios are a sectoral policy case with a clean energy standard that is modeled along what was proposed by President Obama. And what you see here is that under all of these different increases, so full represents our recommended R&D funding, and 10 represents a 10 times increase in recommended R&D funding. The range in benefits goes between about 80 billion in 2050 for the no policy case, and 350 billion a year in the sectoral policy case, under the recommended funding amounts when one compares these scenarios with the business as usual. So these are very significant benefits from increases in R&D investments. We also found that given the answers we obtained from the experts and given our modeling, when you go past a certain amount of 2 to 3 times increasing current funding, you get to a point of decreasing marginal returns, or this is what we expect given the results. What this means is that a very, very rapid increase in investments is something that our results wouldn't support, although of course this is given the information we have today, and this would have to be reviewed a few years down the line. So I'll go to our conclusions from this part of the work. As I mentioned, we found that both a dramatic increase in energy R&D investments and demand pull policies to build markets for new energy technologies are needed. Based on a combination of our elicitations and the modeling, we recommend a twofold increase in energy R&D, and this would be an increase from $5 to $10 billion a year. And we also recognize that in the current fiscal environment, this is something that may be hard, but we also want to point out that there are a wide range of options for complementary funding. For example, PICA's recommended options outside regular appropriations, like a wire charge on electricity. We also found that it is necessary to have a portfolio, an investment in a portfolio of technologies and different stages of development with different levels of risk. This is a concept, again, that comes in very strongly when we look at investing in different technologies and the outcomes in terms of CO2 emissions reductions, oil imports, and economic benefits. In our work, we also optimized the allocation of R&D investments in different areas under different policy scenarios. And we found that this optimal allocation, so how much to give to solar versus nuclear versus something else, was very dependent on policy. So if you had a clean energy standard, you had a very different optimal allocation when you compare that to a CO2 cap on emissions, for example, or no policy case. So this is yet another argument for supporting a portfolio of technologies, given that we don't really know what policy future we're going to be in, and also for tackling policy uncertainty, which is something that we found also in our subsequent parts of the work to mitigate uncertainty for businesses. And finally, the largest percentage increases that we recommend are for solar PV, storage, buildings, and bioenergy, although the largest total investments are going, according to our final recommendations, to nuclear energy, carbon capture and storage, and vehicles. And just very quickly, I'll show you the summary of the specific funding recommendations. This just covers the 7 areas that we modeled in detail, the 7 areas I mentioned earlier, and they together add up to $5.2 billion, which is, more than double the $2.1 billion that were appropriated in 2009. And we also completed our recommendation with other areas that we didn't cover in the elicitation, like ARPA-E, basic energy sciences, wind, and other technology areas. The details of funding for these areas are in the executive summary. We recommend $4.8 billion in that area, and that takes us to the total of $10 billion that we recommended. Now I'm going to let Venki get back to the work on the institutions for innovation.
So I think I want to just spend a few quick minutes on energy innovation institutions. As we know, the Department of Energy, especially in this area, has long had a program in basic energy research ever since, especially in the 70s, and many of the national laboratories became, during the oil crisis, involved in energy research. And the blue here represents stuff which was there for a long period of time, but in the last few years, several new energy innovation institutions have been created, especially at the DOE. This includes ARPA-E, which was recommended by the Rising of the Gathering Storm panel. It includes innovation hubs and also the loan guarantee program, which we all know has received considerable attention recently. So this is a very vast space, and I think one very important message is the energy industry is a long cycle industry. energy industry is very heterogeneous. It depends very much between supply side and demand side, and so one size doesn't fit all, and we do need to have a multiplicity of innovation institutions. Second, we also know that from other studies that for innovation institutions to succeed, they must have a clear mission, funding has to be stable, and in fact, the management of that institution has to have relatively broad authority and autonomy because they are the ones closest to the work. And so I think some of this, what is now being implemented in interesting ways with experiments with energy innovation hubs, EFRCs, and ARPA-E, and they're of course very much in their early stages, but we think that's definitely in the right direction. In fact, we're doing some more detailed studies right now on innovation hubs. And finally, the point which I mentioned with our December workshop, there is of course a real need to go to the large scale in certain particular cases where the costs are high and nobody has this capacity to actually do the demonstration to know that this is a viable technology. And of course, people have suggested other organizations such as the Clean Energy Deployment Administration as a possibility. I want to just remind everybody here 2 or 3 points. About a couple of years ago, a few of us drew this graph which shows the fluctuations in the budget in various aspects of energy. If you look at that fluctuation, it is huge, always at least 30%, 60% year to year, whether you take coal, whether you take petroleum, gas, transport, industry, etc. And it is clearly not a very stable situation. It is not something we are planning for the long cycle. And obviously, as the political forces happen, DOE and the Congress give us this kind of a budget. So when we looked at NREL, and the national laboratories, we found that this was a very serious issue. And first of all, there are some general recommendations which is actually happening. Hopefully, if Energy Innovation Hub came to being, you really want to take a systems approach, and you might have energy innovation hubs in slightly different areas. There might be a spectrum of innovation hubs, and that will have to be developed and to be viewed with a clear mission where you combine basic and applied research. I just don't like those terms, where you're really worried about the future technology and doing the future research for this future technology. You want to be able to, clearly, the contracting system has degraded over the last many years for a variety of reasons, and it's not that we always want to go back to the old times, but unless the people have the autonomy to do the work, they will not be able to succeed. We want to have active management strategies, both at the headquarters as well as at laboratory level, to link research and application. And this interaction is extremely important also for the eventual conversion to the private sector. NREL, in particular, the budget fluctuations have been enormous. It is amazing that they've done some very good work, actually, despite these fluctuations. And in fact, sometimes they do. We talk a lot about solar energy. The one successful company, which is one of the most in the States, is the First Solar, which actually came out of NREL's work. And it's important to note that in this time where, in fact, you want to have multiplicity. And despite these difficulties that did come out, the contracting procedures, especially with regard to them, their autonomy is severely limited, which causes a variety of other issues which will eventually need to be addressed, and especially because it is a laboratory which runs out of a different branch of DOE from the Office of Science, and one has to wonder about the interrelationship between these areas. On the other hand, NREL itself, authorization allows you to spend a certain amount of money for lab-directed funds. They are not spending to that level, presumably because of budget stringency. They're spending significantly less for the future aspects. A couple of other comments. I think the funding for the innovation hubs and the ARPA-E, as we all know, have gone through a lot of political activity. It somehow has to be institutionalized and sustained. Our view is ARPA-E itself has got off to a very good start, and we will hopefully have some very good analysis of innovation hubs as the next portion of our study, because these are important elements in our future in this spectrum. The Energy Frontier Research Centers are particularly important in the relationship with the universities. I think in the past, the relations with the universities, excepting for a few labs, had not been as strong, and the EFRCs are. And what is really important here, where something in the mission which has not been properly accepted, is the workforce development of graduate and postdoctoral students in this area. Very often today, as a faculty member, we are not able to find the right scholars with energy because we missed the boat in educating the graduate students, and somebody either in DOE or somewhere else has to take that as a significant responsibility. That's also true for the weapons lab and all of these others, and this does, to me, is the most important reason and role for the government to play. So I would now like to turn this to Matt Bunn, who will conclude with the private sector and the international.
All right. Well, we realized from the beginning that while the government has a major role to play in energy innovation, it's really the private sector that's the main driver of energy innovation in the United States. And innovation won't be successful unless it's widely deployed in the private sector, and the private sector firms do the majority of the actual R&D that takes place on energy in the United States. So we asked ourselves the question, well, what the heck is the private sector doing right now? And how can the government provide the right incentives and partnerships to make the private sector do more and do it more effectively? And we found that there just isn't the data that you need to make policy decisions out there. There's a few bits of information. There's a National Science Board survey of a few companies. There's data on startup firms from the clean energy finance folks and so on. But there really isn't broad data on what the private sector is doing. So we did a unprecedented survey of the private sector. Unfortunately, we only had the resources to do it at a pilot scale, so we don't have all the data we'd like to have. If anybody wants to provide the funding required for a larger survey, we'd be very interested. But we found actually that at a minimum, there's something like 2.5% of all the business establishments in the United States, so hundreds of thousands of businesses, are doing some kind of energy innovation, way beyond what was previously understood. And that there's much more total private sector investment that is going into energy innovation than was previously understood. Secondly, what motivates that innovation? Energy prices, more than anything else. And so that really makes the point that if we want to motivate the private sector to be investing in clean technologies and low carbon technologies, we have to structure a market so that they have a profit incentive to invest in those technologies through putting, among other things, a substantial price on emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. It's also true that 2/3 of the innovators who answered the survey said that they were investing for their return to be within 2 to 4 years. So they're investing on a very short-term basis, which makes the case for the essential role of government in providing the R&D investments for those longer-term technologies. Now, we also did a really in-depth look at the work that the Department of Energy does with the private sector. Which is done in grants and partnerships and things of that kind, and collected a lot of data. But what we found is that the data just isn't there to collect because DOE hasn't been systematically collecting it over the years. And they don't collect data on what works and what doesn't in what circumstance with their grants, contracts, and private sector. And therefore, it makes it very difficult to learn from experience and to do it better the next time. Looked into that in some detail and concluded that you really need a strategic approach where you have sort of strategic decisions about budgets, research, what kinds of partnerships you're going to do. That feeds in and then feeds back from project design and selection and the actual management of the projects. But you have to not only collect the data, but also analyze the data to say, what can we learn from what happened with this project and what happened with that project? Individual managers know what happened with their projects, but there isn't, across the department, there isn't this sort of systematic data collection. All right. So we also looked at the private sector issues in our economic modeling, and it's clear that the way the market works, the private markets will fund R&D, demonstration, and deployment if they think they can make a profit off of it at a risk comparable to where they can make profits elsewhere in the economy. And so if you really want the private sector to invest, you have to have the market incentives, and you have to have the government policies that establish those market incentives. We also had a workshop on demonstration at the commercial scale of new technologies. There are some technology areas, nuclear is one, carbon capture is another. There are several others where there's this huge problem where there's still too much risk, even once you develop the technology, for the private sector to go out and build that first commercial scale one. So how do you carry out that commercial demonstration? And as Venki showed in the chart of institutions, there really isn't a DOE institution that's really structured to do that. Different offices of DOE have tried to do that at one time or another, often without enormous success. We are thinking that there probably needs to be some kind of an institution, maybe something similar to the Clean Energy Development Administration that's been talked about in the Senate, to handle those kinds of demonstrations. The other things we learned from the private sector surveys is clear that there's a broad range of government policies that matter in this space. It's not just how much is the government spending on energy, how much is the government willing to pay to help build a demonstration plant, but it's things like intellectual property. Immigration is important, getting the bright people into the United States to work on these kinds of things. All right, so we also thought, well, this is not only a US problem, this is a global problem. And there are lots of other countries that are making investments, and what do we do about cooperation with those other countries versus competition with those other countries? So there are potentially huge opportunities from international cooperation. We could share the costs of the most expensive projects. You can cross-fertilize ideas. It may be possible to build things in other countries at lower cost, or there may be different opportunities there. For example, a different geology to demonstrate carbon storage in. And if you're working together, it may increase your potential to move in that market in the future. That's why a lot of companies are doing things in the Chinese market in particular. And we found, we did some data collection on what other countries are doing, and we found that just a handful of the developing countries, if you count what the state-owned enterprises in those countries are doing, are actually making larger investments in energy research, development, demonstration, deployment on these new technologies than all of the developed countries combined in the OECD. And most of that, what those developing countries are doing, is in China. So China is making really gigantic investments in these areas. And they already have big shares of solar and wind manufacturing. They're soon to join the ranks of the major nuclear exporters, and they're building within China more nuclear reactors than any other country in the world. Almost half of the nuclear reactors in the world that are under construction are in China. They're investing in electric vehicles and carbon sequestration, and they have huge state support for those investments. Now, unfortunately, the US government does not really have a coordinated approach to how it does this international energy R&D cooperation, ERD3 cooperation. There's a lot of different agencies and actors involved, and most of them are sort of off doing their own particular projects and things. And so we concluded, first of all, that there needs to be both a top-down and a bottom-up approach, and that those have to be enabled by some data collection. So we argued that there needs to be a new interagency committee established to set out sort of strategic priorities for international cooperation and coordinate it at the top level. But at the same time, there ought to be money available for each of the agencies that's funding some energy R&D ought to set aside a small portion of its money to fund ideas about international cooperation that come up from the bottom up. And then you ought to collect and analyze data on what's going on and what's worked in a past project, what didn't work in a past project, why, what are the lessons learned, so you can learn by doing. And in fact, there were several themes that came out from our work that you'll see at the end of the executive summary. One clear theme was there's a need for stability in policy. At our demonstration workshop, I think one of my favorite quotes was a chief technology officer of a major energy company who said, "We are trying to make 20-year investments on the basis of 6-month policies." And that's particularly clear today in the aftermath of the collapse of the supercommittee. A second major theme was that you need to have more learning by doing within this system. You need to sort of collect the data and analyze the data so that you know what works and what doesn't work. A third, I think, major theme was there needs to be more interaction between the government's energy efforts and the private sector's energy efforts, and more information coming from the private sector about where the opportunities are, what motivates more innovation, and so on. So anyway, those are a few of the major themes. So fundamentally, we have a huge challenge before us. We have to provide the energy for a rapidly growing world economy, probably a doubling of energy demand over the next couple of decades, while greatly reducing the amount of carbon that's being dumped into the atmosphere. And that's just a gigantic challenge. If you think of the scale of the energy system, and tens of trillions of dollars of investment in the infrastructure that exists around the world. The past transitions of this kind have taken decades, and we just don't have that kind of time. So we really do need a revolution in the pace at which these new energy technologies are developed and deployed. So we need, in the United States, greatly expanded targeted investments in energy R&D, as Laura talked about. We need a different approach to managing our energy institutions so that we get more bang for the buck if we're going to spend more money. We need policies that create the market incentives for the private sector to innovate and to deploy the new technologies. And we need new approaches both to working with the private sector in partnership and to working with other countries in partnership. And we need all of that put together in a focused and integrated strategy. Now, I know it's a little bit bizarre to be here in Washington on the day after the collapse of the supercommittee talking about let's spend a lot more money on energy R&D. But our argument is that these are in fact very important investments for the long-term future of the country that will pay off many times over. Laura made the point that a few $1 billion of additional R&D investment today in our modeling leads to many tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars a year in return for consumers and producers in the economy by 2050. And there's also that's just what's going on within the United States. We didn't even model the impact of global deployments. And this is a very competitive marketplace for what will be one of the biggest markets in the world. The energy technology market is trillions of dollars a year. And we think these investments are crucial for the United States to play a leading role in those markets. And there are a variety of ways that have been suggested where you could make these kinds of investments outside the normal appropriations process without adding to the national debt or national deficits. One past example that I think is a good one is that in the past they put a small charge on transport of natural gas to fund R&D on natural gas, and that led to real breakthroughs that were then deployed in the private sector and generated hugely more money than it had cost in recovering natural gas from coal bed methane. So that kind of idea on a larger scale I think is very much possible in the energy space. And with that, I will stop talking and...
Thanks. Acknowledgements. The next paragraph.
Yes. Okay, so we have just a list of those of us who were participants, and we have 3 of the key researchers in the audience: Gabe Chan, Skook Jones, listed here as Charles Jones, but everybody calls him Skook, and Nat Logar. Let's see if I can get to the acknowledgements page. And we had a very distinguished advisory board that included public sector, private sector, academic people, people from some of the venture capital firms in particular. Kelly Sims Gallagher was one of the leaders of this project in the early days and remains a key advisor. A bunch of people who worked on the Marcal and a bunch of others. So, and in particular, the Doris Duke Foundation, who funded the whole project. So there I really will shut up. I should mention, though, one other thing, which is the entire report, which is hundreds of pages, is on the Belfer Center webpage, belfercenter.org. And we will be available now for questions for some time. And after the briefing, if there are people from, newspapers or TV or whatever who want to do additional interviews, some of us may be available after the briefing as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. And so we'd welcome any questions which you may have, and maybe I will stand up just for a second so that I can point out, but any of us can take some questions. With the lights, I can't see very well.
Yeah, the lights are coming right into our eyes.
Right. That's why I decided to stand up and do this. Yes? Peter.
Well, first of all, congratulations on delivery. It's an important project. I was curious, it seems like from the executive summary, and of course we look forward to seeing the large tome, executive summary or the Table 2 seems to be the core of the recommendations on those two tables talk about the recommended support. And I was curious in the discussion as I was reading it, and several of you mentioned the sort of large uncertainties that might affect your recommendations, like the degree to which shale gas might affect market conditions. There may be some other large wave international kinds of conditions that will affect the relative prospects of the technologies on that table. So I was wondering, did you have time in this project to speculate about, for example, if shale gas really did take off over the next several years, how those recommendations might change? I think the only thing you said in the summary was that DOE would have to reassess the situation.
Yeah. We did have a scenario where we had continued low natural gas prices, trying to in some way model this case of having a lot of shale gas for a long time. And those recommendations also take into account the insights from that scenario. We didn't look at impact from other nations, having breakthroughs in technologies. We were limited in our work to the United States. So that we didn't consider, and we're thinking that would be a next stage of this work, looking at the international picture and what is the impact of diffusions from other countries and to other countries. But this certainly considers the scenario of low natural gas prices for a long time. But as I said during the presentation, these recommendations were made with the best information and the best modeling we could think of doing today. And obviously, as you do more, you find out more information. So the thinking is that in 4 or 5 years, maybe we will see ways to productively invest, 20 instead of $10 billion a year.
I'd like to add one more point to that, which is a slightly different point, is, of course, what may happen is not always predictable. And hopefully, because of the innovation hubs which are being set up, that there will be some real breakthrough technologies with fuel from sunlight. We don't know that would be very important. We obviously have to allow for that. So one of the things which is very important, we really have these focused innovation hubs, and same may be true of ARPA-E. And so that is clearly, would be well funded then. Yeah.
But I think the low price of shale gas also raises, I think, an important question about the role of government versus the private sector in developing new energy technologies. Because at the moment, when you have $4 gas, it means that the private sector isn't going to be spending a lot of money developing a lot of these technologies, especially nuclear, for example. A lot of the nuclear technologies basically don't make any sense if you have no carbon price and $4 natural gas. But then isn't the role of government in part to develop options that society may very much want to have when it's in a situation where there is a carbon price and there's $8 or $10 natural gas, which could easily arise? So it seems to me that the government needs to be looking at a broader segment of potential future scenarios in looking at the technologies that may be essential for society to have available in this broader set of future scenarios that may take place, whereas the private sector is more focused on what's happening right now in the market.
Good morning, Lord Friberg, Office of Science and Innovation, Swedish Embassy. Congratulations to a very pertinent project. And I was wondering, and I'm sorry if I missed it in the beginning, I was a little late. Were you able in your modeling to take into account what is starting to look like something like the Moore's law for the falling price of solar as how much more you create? So just doing R&D compared to actually getting it out and getting it expanded into the marketplace. Were you able to capture that kind of dynamic?
We captured the R&D part, but we didn't introduce the impact of additional deployment. Basically, one of the reasons for that is that there is a lot of uncertainty, even though we're seeing, if you look at the learning rate of solar photovoltaics at different points in time, it differs very much. Very recently, we had a very sharp decline, but before that, there was a more stable price. So that's something that we did not include because we felt that it was something that is hard to. It's yet another uncertainty that we would have to model.
Let me put it a little bit differently. We didn't include explicitly, a percentage cost reduction for a factor of 2 increase in deployment in the modeling. But when we were talking to the experts and they were making projections about what will the price of a technology be in 2030, and what would it be with more R&D, they were taking in mind, well, how much of it will have gotten deployed by then? And so they were making their estimates of what is solar going to cost, et cetera, based on their understanding of what's already happening in the solar market. The other thing I would say with respect to solar in particular is that it seems clear that the pace of reductions that has happened recently is unsustainable. Because basically what's happened is there's substantial overcapacity in the market, and some countries like Solyndra, as an obvious one, have gone bankrupt because they've been the high cost producers in an oversupplied market. So I would be quite surprised if it kept on the same trajectory as it's been the last couple of years. But not to say that the prices of solar aren't going to continue to go down, but they probably won't go down as sharply as they have been.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Okay, I had a question. I think I wanted to make sure I understood what Laura was saying about the pace at which we would increase the investment in R&D. We went through a doubling in the NIH budget not that long ago, and Richard Freeman, one of your colleagues at Harvard, has written about how difficult it is to spend money wisely and productively when it increases that quickly. So I wanted to make sure I understood at what rate you thought R&D spending could increase and still be used productively, and related to that, what constraints there are that might prevent us from increasing effective use of that money. And then I think following up a little bit on this past question, I agree that I don't think there is a Moore's law for photovoltaic cells or any of these other technologies. When I look at your chart about the median cost improvements that we could expect by 2030, they're not that great. And I wonder if part of your exercise was to go with, if we were to get these and project what type of energy prices we would have at the time, what difference it would actually make, what market forces alone could achieve if we could achieve these technological goals, and if it falls short, then what do we do?
That's what that shows, right? You can answer
right.
that.
Yeah, so on on the pace, there are two things. So one is how many potential projects or ideas or technologies are there out there, and to use the funds productively. And then that is where we got to this question of where do you get the point of decreasing marginal returns? Where, when you start spending, 20, $50 billion from the input that we have, there doesn't seem to be that many projects out there. In terms of how quickly you could go from $5 to $10 billion, again, this may be something that could happen within, 5 years. We didn't spend a lot of time, trying to pinpoint exactly how long we should double it, how long it should take to double the funding. But certainly we recognize that as a problem, and it has to be something that has to be done over a few years. On the constraints to the number of projects and so forth, this is what we found when we interviewed. We had these 23 high-level interviews, and we found many people saying, right now, if you wanted to spend 10 times more money, you just wouldn't have the projects, you just wouldn't have the scientists, you just wouldn't have the companies. So here the constraint at this point seemed to be the people and the ideas, but of course the hope is that as you do more research, you would have more people and more ideas, and then in the future maybe you may want to increase. But that's a very good question.
That's a very important point, that you cannot just jack it up and then go down. The steadiness is very, very important. And the human capital, if I look back, we, and not just blame the DOE, did not develop the necessary people infrastructure for what we need today. That's a very serious issue.
Let me address your other question, which was about, you said, the cost reductions don't look that big. I want to, and what will happen in the market. So what we were doing with our economic modeling was precisely looking at, well, if we get these kinds of cost reductions, if the experts turn out to be right in their projections, what impact will that have on the things you care about? What impact will it have on the cost of the energy system? What impact would it have on carbon emissions? What impact would it have on dependence on oil, and especially imported oil? And so we modeled all of those things in. Now, the point I would make about the chart and the executive summary, it may be that the way we've presented it is a little misleading. We're trying to be, conservative. We're comparing what the cost would be if you continued investing the way you are today in 2030 versus what the cost would be if you did increased investments. We're not comparing to today's cost. So we're expecting that there'll be substantial improvements even on a business as usual R&D trajectory. And then these are the further improvements that you would get compared to a business as usual trajectory is what's presented in those assessments.
All of the actual estimates of the cost today, the cost in 2030, with R&D or with more R&D and with less R&D, they're all in the report. So you will be able to see, the decreasing cost under a business as usual scenario to see what the baseline is. And yes, that's right. That will be more consistent with what we're expecting today.
And the key conclusion, again, you could put 10 times as much money, you won't get much improvement, especially if you don't put the right demand side policies.
Right.
That's just very important, not to be forgotten. Any other questions? Yes.
So could I drill down a bit on your analysis and your recommendations for market incentives, the adoption of the new technologies that come out? So you do talk a bit about the accounting for the price of carbon, but do you also go into analysis of some other sector-specific incentives, whether adoption of biofuels or implementation of photovoltaics? Are there things to look for in particular, or policies in particular that you're advocating here?
So we modeled both an economy-wide cap and trade system and a clean energy standard that applied only to the electricity sector. And we also concluded that while we didn't look at more detailed sector-specific policies in much detail, we concluded that there are, beyond just the lack of a price on carbon, there are other market failures that you're going to need some specific sector-specific policies to address. But we didn't, that's a big and complicated can of worms, and we didn't That was one thing we didn't go into in a lot of detail. But the main modeling was either a economy-wide cap and trade that was a pretty substantial cap without very much offset, so it was an aggressive version of cap and trade, or a fairly aggressive clean energy standard. One of the things you found in that modeling, and it's to some extent an artifact of the way we did it, is because a number of the energy technologies that we looked at were electricity technologies, you find even bigger sort of returns to the R&D for the clean energy standard than for the economy-wide cap and trade, because the only way you can reduce the cost of dealing with the clean energy standard is by doing better on technologies that we were looking at specifically. And so the R&D helps you more in a certain sense. But that's an artifact of the modeling, not what would happen in the real world necessarily.
Fair enough, thanks.
Any other, or maybe Saul? Yes.
Congratulations again. I noticed under your recommendations, you had gone back and you said the cooperation between the private sector and the federal government.
I'm unable to hear. Could you be a little louder?
I'll stand closer.
Thank you.
Under your recommendations, you had noted that there needed to be more cooperation between the government and the private sector. And my curiosity was, had you gone back and looked at a lot of the public-private sector partnerships that had already been established by the federal government over the last 10 years on this, and looked where it succeeded and where it failed? Many of your recommendations are the exact same things that the government did for the Asia-Pacific Partnership, for the Global Entrepreneurship Partnership that is headed by state right now. I'm just curious if you had done a comparison and actually looked at some of those successes or failures and then integrated into your report.
There are, so you're talking about the partnerships with the private sector and not with other countries?
Actually,
or both?
yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So that was the original plan. We wanted to go through the partnerships, the grants, and the cooperative agreements that the Department of Energy at different offices has with the private sector. And we weren't able, we wanted to do a study where we didn't just look at one or two cases, where we evaluated the whole set of policies. We thought it was going to be very hard to just look at one or two. And what we found, as Matt was indicating, is that there's no data on this. We managed to find a data that was a transparency data, USAspending.gov, that had a list of projects and talked about level of cost sharing and whether it was a grant or a cooperative agreement. But we found no place where you could determine what are the technologies being funded and what are the outcomes of these projects. So that was the original goal of that part of the project. What we found until after a lot of investigation is that the best that we could do was track the number of projects, the actual amounts, and the level of cost shared without really being able to say anything about the effectiveness of these projects. What we could say from even just that piece is that there's not much learning happening in terms of project selection and execution and evaluation, because that's not being tracked at the government level. And similarly, when we looked at the international cooperation, we, if in the chapter on cooperation, we have a list of agreements, of memorandums of understanding, of agencies, and again, in a lot of cases, we weren't able to find a lot of actual work or actual things that happened as a result of a lot of these agreements. That's something that we do discuss. It's very hard to know what actually came out of different agreements, but again, the problem was that we couldn't really evaluate.
Did you do any personal interviews?
We did personal interviews, yes.
Because I'm familiar with a lot of the international partnerships and public-private partnerships that are going on within the government, and I know very much that they do catalog a lot of those successes. So if you guys would like to follow up.
So it's not that there's no information about a few partnerships.
Well, let me give you an example. I mean, you had mentioned that there should be better coordination for businesses to come in, and I was kind of curious if you were looking at small businesses or big businesses for that cooperation, because many of the incubating technologies come from the small businesses, but they end up hitting the roadblock when they try to expand. But in the federal government, most of the small businesses kind of disappear, and the bigger businesses have better lobbyists and have more access. So I was just kind of curious if you had looked at things like that in your recommendations, to.
We have data on the funding that is going through the SBIR to the small businesses, and there we didn't find evidence of any better lessons learned, let's say, from previous projects. We don't, if I remember correctly, I don't think we say anything specifically about small businesses being shut off.
I'm just curious.
Although we do, I think actually we do recognize that it's, there are obviously greater barriers if you're a small business in going through the whole, grants process. But I think that's where we stop.
I think you raise a good point. I think what we did in the case of the labs was sort of case studies of a couple of particular institutions, and I think. And a further round of research, what we may try to do, having found that the sort of consistent, comprehensive data isn't being collected, is to go back to a case study approach and do a few in-depth case studies on some of the public-private partnerships or the international partnerships. Many of the international partnerships that we looked at, and we collected a lot of data on what's going on international agreements and so on, and a lot of them are not actually doing R&D. They're sort of, developing standards or helping a country deploy things that already exist or whatever. The number that are actually doing R&D is actually, we were surprised at how small it was.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we should, it looks like, any other final comment? I want to thank all of you for coming and participating. We'll be around for a little while longer. If somebody wants to talk informally, as Matt mentioned, or others, we'd be happy. Of course, also, you can send us email, and the Welfare Center website will have the full report on it. Jim, it's on already, isn't
Already
it?
has the full report on it, yeah.
Please
belfarecenter.org.
Director, and it should be right
Or
there.
energytechnologypolicy.org. Either one.
And so you can see the full report. Clearly, much more work has to be still done, just on innovation institutions alone.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.